All right, guys. So President Joseph Robinette Biden recently sat down on MSNBC to do an interview on some updates with Israel and Gaza. And I think that this was pretty revealing for a bunch of different reasons. So we're just going to watch our way through it and I'll commentate as we go. So let's go ahead and start this off here.
You were caught on a hot mic after your State of the Union address talking to Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Senator Michael Bennet saying, quote, "I told him, Bibi, and don't repeat this, but you and I are going to have a come to Jesus meeting." What do you mean by that?
What I meant was, it's an expression used in the southern part of my state, meaning a serious meeting. And it was, I've known Bibi for 50 years, and he knew what I meant by it.
So what's the come to Jesus part? Like, what tough love are you?
Okay, so we'll continue here, but I do just it's pretty funny to use that phrase. Now, I do know that that's a real phrase. People use it all the time. I've heard people use that throughout my entire life. But just amazing to use that when you're talking to the Israeli prime minister, a guy who you know is the leader of this Jewish state or whatever, right? To say we need a come to Jesus moment. So anyways, I think that that's just funny. I know he probably didn't mean anything like religiously by it, but kind of funny there.
Are you going to give to the prime minister?
What's happening is he has a right to defend Israel, a right to continue to pursue Hamas, but he must pay more attention to the innocent lives being lost as a consequence of the actions taken. He's hurting, in my view, he's hurting Israel more than helping Israel by making the rest of the world, it's contrary to what Israel stands for. And I think it's a big mistake. So I want to see a ceasefire. And I'm starting with a major exchange of prisoners for a 6-week period. We're going into Ramadan. It should be nothing happening. And we should build off of that ceasefire. And look, I've spoken with the majority of the Arab leaders from Saudi Arabia to Egypt to Jordan. They're all prepared to fully recognize Israel and begin to rebuild the region. And that's the focus. What comes after Gaza? What's next? It's a tough decision, but there's a lot that can be done.
On the ceasefire,
Okay, so there's a lot there, right? First off, when he talks about what Israel is doing right now, hurting them on the global stage and with, regional relationships, that part is absolutely true, right? Maybe he should be questioning why Israel's conduct is hurting them with those regional actors and with the broad majority of countries and people around the world. Maybe it could have something to do with the fact that this is not a targeted war against Hamas, but is in fact a genocide. Maybe that could have something to do with it. Now, he insists that all of these surrounding states are ready to resume normalization ties with Israel after Gaza is finished off, I guess. I have my doubts on that, not because I think that, the leaders of Saudi Arabia or whatever the fuck are like noble people or that they are good faith actors or anything like that. It's really just because a lot of the populations in some of these like theocratic dictatorial regimes in some of these Middle Eastern countries, the populations there are very pro-Palestine. The leadership may not be, but the populations there are. And so if you just if Israel continues to just completely obliterate Gaza and then they wrap it up and then you immediately start pushing forward with normalization ties with Israel, you could have a massive uprising from your own population. And some of those countries like the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or wherever the hell, a lot of those countries could be facing significant pressure from their own populations, right? Or destabilizing pressure. And that's something they obviously don't want to see. Now, other parts about what he just said there, I mean, clearly, saying that Israel has a right to continue to go after Hamas and to defend themselves. What Israel is doing right now is not going after Hamas. They are not defending themselves, okay? The vast majority of the people who they have killed so far since October 7th have been women and children. When you add in innocent men, it's like anywhere between 80 to 90% of the people they've killed have been innocent civilians, okay? Now, the degree to which they've even destroyed Hamas or the ability for Hamas to continue functioning, that's yet to be seen. We really can't get a real, accurate estimate of that, right? And so, the idea that you're just going to, on the one hand, talk about how, there's a humanitarian crisis and how we need to get more aid in, but at the same time, Israel has a right to continue doing what they've been doing. Those two things are completely at odds, okay? And then he goes on to talk about this prospect for a ceasefire. And the question that he's getting here is, where do you think that that's at right now? Because today, this is Monday right now. This is the first day of the holy month of Ramadan for Muslims. And so, this has a potential to spark off into an even broader flashpoint in the region or in the West Bank. And I'm going to show you some videos from the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound here in a minute. And so, this is all just an absolute clusterfuck. We covered Joe Biden just last week or so, before the Michigan primaries, whenever that was, coming out and saying, oh, we're going to have a ceasefire by Monday. That didn't materialize. And then in this interview, he says we're going to have a ceasefire, before Ramadan. That doesn't materialize. So, what is actually going on with these ceasefire negotiations, right? So let's go ahead and hear it from him.
It is Saturday. The holy month of Ramadan starts on Monday. Is it possible that a ceasefire deal could be reached in time for Ramadan to start?
I'm a CIA director in that region right this minute, still talking about it. I think it's always possible. I never give up on that.
What is your red line with Prime Minister Netanyahu? Do you have a red line? For instance, would invasion of Rafah, which you have urged him not to do, would that be a red line?
It is a red line, but I'm never going to leave Israel. The defense of Israel is still critical. So there's no red line. I'm going to cut off all weapons so they don't have the Iron Dome to protect them. They don't have. But there's red lines that if he crosses, you cannot have 30,000 more Palestinians dead as a consequence of going after. There's other ways to deal with the trauma caused by Hamas. And it's like, look, the first time I went over, I sat with them and I sat with the work cabinet. I said, look, don't make the mistake America made. America made a mistake. We went after bin Laden until we got him, but we shouldn't have gone into Ukraine. We shouldn't have gone into the whole thing in Iraq and Afghanistan. It wasn't necessary. It just caused more problems in the race than it's going to cure it.
Okay, so, fair point there, where it comes to the U.S., response to 9/11, going and invading two countries that didn't really have anything to do with 9/11, completely destabilizing the region, costing the lives of hundreds of thousands of innocent people. So, he's right on that front. But when doing the comparison here with Israel, they've already blown past that, guys. If you talk about proportions here of the population of Gaza versus Iraq and Afghanistan and the entirety of the war on terror, Israel's already blown past, okay, that proportionate destruction of civilian life and infrastructure. We're well past that point, guys. The entirety of the northern strip of Gaza and many portions of the south of Gaza are totally uninhabitable at this point. Okay, not only have we had tens of thousands of civilians that have been killed and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands more, who have been injured or forever traumatized for the rest of their life, but there's no real functioning infrastructure that is left inside of Gaza. And now they're talking about expanding the operations of a ground invasion into Rafah, which is a place that has over a million people from Gaza who are cramped into what is basically just a giant refugee camp that Israel has forced them into. And now you're talking about going and invading Rafah. Okay, the humanitarian crisis that is already happening right now is catastrophic. To call it dire would be the understatement of the century. And you're talking about drastically worsening that humanitarian crisis by going into Rafah. And so for him to then turn around and to say, on the one hand, yeah, maybe that would be a red line, but I'm never going to cut off any weapons to Israel. Okay, so then you don't have a red line. What he wants to have here is rhetorically, I'm going to have a red line. Oh, I don't want Israel to do this. I would prefer they not do that, right? And wagging his finger at them behind the scenes. Ooh, cut it out there. But then materially, not using any of the leverage that he has at his disposal in order to pressure or to force Israel not to do the things that he supposedly doesn't want them to do, right? So you can't have it both ways. What he wants here is an easy, rhetorical, virtue signaling sort of victory here for himself. So he can go to his own base that wants a ceasefire. He can go to the American people and say, look, I was against this. I'm not responsible for it. But also, by the way, I'm going to continue sending them the weapons that they're using to do all of these things that I claim that I don't want them to do. It's utter nonsense. You don't have any real red lines. Okay, so don't come out here and pretend as if there is a red line when there's clearly not, right? But they continue here.
Who actually wants a deal? Do you think Hamas actually wants a ceasefire?
Well, I think Hamas would like a total ceasefire across the board because they would see they have a better chance to survive and maybe rebuild. But that's not what I think the vast majority of people think. You have to look. After what happened in World War II and the carpet bombing that took place, what happened was we ended up in a situation where we changed the rules of the game, what constitutes legitimate rules of war, and they should be abided by.
Okay, so that was like a weird left turn in the middle of his response that he was giving there. He started out by saying that, yes, Hamas does want a permanent ceasefire, which is kind of a pretty big admission there, right? Because just last week, I was covering, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, who were starting to come out and say, no, we're in favor of the ceasefire, even though it's just this 6-week temporary ceasefire. And then after that, Israel can go back and continue the genocide. So, I mean, the kind of logic or the argument that the Biden administration, it looked like they were trying to make, was we're the ones who are in favor of a ceasefire. It's Hamas that's blocking that ceasefire. But here he is coming out and admitting that, yeah, Hamas has proposed a permanent ceasefire, right? And one of the ones that they recently proposed included getting the hostages back out of Gaza into Israel, right? And so it's a pretty big admission there for him to just come out and say that, right? Because you guys, the United States and Israel, have actually been blocking the ceasefires, which is what everybody wants. And so he follows it up by saying, after World War II, we had a new sort of like international, laws of war that we began to follow because we didn't want to repeat some of the same mistakes of obliterating civilian infrastructure and killing as many civilians as died during World War II. That's true, right? And he says that those rules should be abided by, but Israel is not abiding by those rules. Okay? And in fact, you hear from many Israeli spokesmen and politicians who come out and they bring up, like during World War II, the bombing of Dresden, right? They bring up World War II examples to justify what they are doing in Gaza, almost pretending as if, the point Biden is making here doesn't exist, that we didn't create an entire new global, international standard for the laws of war after World War II, specifically to prevent that from happening again, okay? But I mean, again, you look at Israel's actions on the ground in Gaza. There is no possible way that you can make the case that they have been fully abiding by international law. This is why they're facing an ICJ case led by South Africa that the ICJ has already ruled it's plausible that Israel is in the midst of committing a genocide. And the Biden administration responded to that by saying that it was meritless and that it was counterproductive. So you can't play this game of we care about international law, we care about human rights, but at the same time, when those standards of international law and these standards of enforceability, whatever that may mean, on the global stage to abide by human rights law, you can't then turn around as you're pretending to care about those things and then completely ignore them and call them meritless and counterproductive when it's brought against one of your allies in an attempt to stop them from committing a genocide. You can't have it both ways. Again, he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth throughout the entirety of this interview.
Some have suggested you should go back to Israel and address the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. Is that something you would do?
Yes.
Would that have to be at the invitation of the prime minister, or could that be at the invitation of the president?
I'd rather not discuss it more.
Does that mean that has been discussed, the possibility of going back to Israel and addressing the Knesset? Okay. Let's talk about the temporary pier that you announced during your State of the Union address to get supplies into Gaza. It's going to take 60 days to get that constructed. What more are you doing in the absence of cooperation from Netanyahu and a bill from Congress to get supplies into Gaza, more humanitarian aid into Gaza?
Everything we can. We're pressing Israel to open up access to the north from Israel. We're also doing airdrops. I know several people were killed with airdrop. There's a way to avoid that in the future. We're working with our Arab friends to figure out how much we can get in. Everything, look, it's a desperate situation. Food, medicine, everything needed, they're badly needed, and it's needed now.
You're heading to Michigan?
Okay. I mean, listen, again, guys, the idea that we are going to spend upwards of 2 months, and that's their estimate right now. The last time that I talked about the Gaza port idea that the Biden administration is implementing right now, the last time I talked about that, the estimate was that it would take 6 weeks. Now it's up to 60 days. That's 2 months, guys. Do you know how many people are set on the current trajectory to die in the next couple of months in Gaza? Okay, because he said at the beginning of this interview, well, one of my red lines, this red line that I supposedly have, is that we can't have another 30,000 Palestinians who are going to die. 2 things on that. Number one, that 30,000 number is a drastic undercount by any stretch of the imagination, okay? It's been sitting at around 30,000 for like, what, a month and a half, 2 months now? The reality of that count is that the Gaza Ministry of Health relies on the hospital system, a functioning hospital system, in order to be able to count reliably the amount of people who have been killed and injured by this offensive. 31 or so out of the previously functioning 36 hospitals in Gaza are no longer operable, okay? So you cannot get a real, accurate, updated count of the amount of people who have been killed. I would not be surprised at all if the real number of killed inside of Gaza is anywhere from like 50 to 75,000. It could be as high as 100,000. Again, we don't know. But when you look at the scale of civilian death and destruction inside of Gaza, it's hard for me to believe that it's as low as 30,000, even though that's incredibly high, right? And so when he says we can't have another 30,000 people in Gaza die, first off, we may already be past that point right now. Second off, you are now saying that there's no red line even if Israel goes into Rafah, which could easily result, as famine is looming, as diseases are looming, that could easily result in another 30,000 Palestinians being killed as a part of that offensive into this massive 1 million plus, civilian refugee camp that Israel is currently planning and that you are not objecting to, right? So when you take all of that together, for him to turn around and to say, well, we care about the Palestinians who are suffering in Gaza. We hope that Israel abides by international law. We're trying to work for this ceasefire, and we're building this port to try to get aid in. None of this matters if you are not willing to use the leverage that you have at your disposal, namely, number one, would be cutting off the weapons. Step one, cut off the weapons, right? In a real just world, we would be sanctioning the shit out of Israel right now, okay? But number one would be cutting off the weapons, okay? I told you guys about that story. Over 100 under-the-counter weapons deals to Israel that the Biden administration has done since October 7th, where they intentionally lowered the dollar amount of the aid that they were sending at any given time so that it wouldn't have to be notified to Congress and therefore to the American people. So you're shipping them millions, hundreds of millions of dollars under the table, proposing to send them billions of dollars on top of the billions we already give them in weapons to continue what they're doing. You can't do that and then turn around and pretend as if you have any sort of remotely red lines. You don't. Okay? The Gaza port idea, the reason I have an issue with it, is not because hypothetically 2 months down the line, if we're lucky, maybe you'll get a trickle of aid into Gaza. Of course, any aid would be appreciated to people who are literally on the brink of starvation. But the point is, there are so many different routes into Gaza from the north, as he was just sort of alluding to there vaguely, right? So many different entry points where trucks by the hundreds, if not the thousands, are being held up by Israel. And you're choosing to go and spend how much money with how many troops, upwards of over 1,000 that they're estimating, to go and build a fucking port, a floating port, that you can deliver a fraction of the aid that's actually needed right now, while continuing to do airdrops, one of the recent airdrops, that killed 5 Palestinians as it was falling from the sky. So that's your plan, instead of trying to pressure Israel in any way, shape, and form? I mean, it's utterly delusional. But here we go. We're going to finish off with this. In Michigan, he's questioned about the uncommitted vote, and this may be the most delusional part about this entire interview, guys.
Where on the campaign trail, probably in the next few days, where more than 100,000 people voted uncommitted in the primary to protest your handling of the situation in Gaza. Some have said they will never vote for you. One told Charles Blow of the New York Times, and I'm quoting, "As bad as Mr. Trump's rhetoric was and him putting a travel ban on 5 Muslim countries, he wasn't overseeing and actively arming a genocide." Those are tough words. What's your response to that widely shared sentiment?
It's not widely shared. You guys make judgments you're not capable of making. That's not what all those people said. What they said was they're very upset, and I don't blame them for being upset. There's families there. There are people who are dying. They want something done about it. And they're saying, Joe, do something. Do something. But the idea that they all think it's genocide is just not, that's a different situation. Look, I can fully understand, can't you? You have a family member there, families that come from a family that is still isolated there and maybe victimized. It's understandable they feel that way. And that's why I'm doing everything I can to try to stop it.
Okay, so finishing it off there, again, with a very easily disprovable lie that you're doing everything that you possibly can to stop it. No, you're not. You just said earlier in the interview that Israel going into Rafah is not something you would be willing to use your leverage to stop them from doing. So you're not. I mean, number one, when it comes to the uncommitted vote, okay, this was a very clear message. They were telling Joe Biden, get a fucking ceasefire immediately. That was the message that was being sent by the uncommitted protest vote. Now, he turns around when this journalist, I think, accurately characterizes it as many Americans feel as though Israel is in the midst of committing a genocide, and therefore that you are in the midst of aiding and abetting and arming and funding a genocide. And his answer to that is to turn around and say, well, that's just your judgment, right? That's not a widely shared sentiment. Guys, I've shown you the polling data on this before. You don't just have to take the uncommitted vote in Michigan or Minnesota or any number of these other states where hundreds of thousands and the totality of it have participated in that. You can look at polling data. How many Americans believe that Israel is in the midst of committing a genocide? Guys, it is upwards of half of his own party, half of his own voting coalition believes that Israel is committing a genocide and that therefore he is complicit in it. That's not some small 5% of the American people. It is a massive chunk of a constituency that you need to win. And it also just kind of pisses me off that he's sitting here saying, well, you could kind of understand it if somebody has a family member who's been victimized in Gaza, right? Or they're isolated in Gaza. It is not just Arab Americans. It is not just people who have family in Gaza who care about this issue. It is a massive, diverse coalition that cares about this issue. I don't have any family members in Gaza. I cover this shit on a daily basis. I don't have any personal connection to Gaza, and I care about this, right? If I got the opportunity, I would go and vote uncommitted. So, I mean, you can look at the polling data in places like Michigan as well. It's not just Dearborn, Michigan, with a large Arab population that voted uncommitted. It was 10% or more in basically every single district inside of Michigan that voted, okay? You had young people, you had Black Americans, you had Hispanic Americans, Arab Americans, you had a huge, wide coalition of people who were voting uncommitted to call for a ceasefire, okay? And that was just people who decided to show up to the polls specifically to cast a protest vote. So if anything, that's an undercount in terms of a reflection of how the broad majority of the American people are feeling right now. That was people who are typically, you could assume, loyal Democratic supporters who show up to vote in the primaries. Think about how many people are going to stay home and not vote. It's not that people are going to flip to Trump. They may vote third party. They may not vote at all. That's your two biggest threats right there. Okay, so you can't just brush that off. You can't pretend as if that's not some wide coalition that believes that. It is, and it's a problem for you. Not just with Arab Americans, with anybody with any sort of like moral conscience who cares about what the US government is complicit in, right? Including myself and many of the people who view my channel as well, who don't have family members inside of Gaza, but care about our own government being complicit in a genocide. But anyways, that's the interview there. I don't think that any of that was too surprising. And of course, we saw him sort of say, oh, well, I kind of have a red line, but I'm not willing to enforce anything on that red line, so I don't really have a red line. And so, of course, the response from Netanyahu is that he vows to defy Biden's red line on Rafah. I mean, even this Politico headline, I wouldn't even think that this is accurate to say that he's defying Biden's red line, because there is no red line. There's no punishment here for Netanyahu if he disobeys Biden in this circumstance, right? But they got a couple of details here that I think are interesting. They say, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he intends to press ahead with an invasion of the city of Rafah on the southern border with the Gaza Strip in defiance of Joe Biden, who has warned that such an offensive would be a red line. Okay, again, a completely meaningless, hollow red line. They say relief organizations have warned that an attack on Rafah on the border with Egypt, now a refuge for about half of Gaza's 2.3 million population, would result in widespread civilian casualties. No shit. Germany's foreign minister said that it would be a humanitarian catastrophe. When asked on Sunday whether Israeli forces would move into Rafah, Netanyahu replied, quote, "We'll go there. We're not going to leave them. I have a red line. You know what the red line is? That October 7th doesn't happen again. Never happens again." Okay? So, I mean, listen, I'm not going to get too far into this, but the idea that going in and terrorizing 2.3 million people, okay, in your campaign against them, to completely obliterate the civilian infrastructure, to kill tens of thousands of innocent people, okay, at this point, at least over 15,000 children, to destroy the entirety of the Gaza Strip, the idea that that is going to lead to a lasting peace, what world does this guy fucking live in? I mean, it's delusional. If anything, all you're doing is creating a situation in which the generation that is being terrorized by Israel right now is going to grow up, and even if it's not Hamas, even if you succeed in removing Hamas as an organization from power, do you think that they are going to respect that situation in the long term? Especially as Netanyahu, continues to talk about, well, I'm completely against the prospects of a two-state solution. Okay, so you're going to continue the apartheid, continue the ethnic cleansing, continue the genocidal campaign inside of Gaza, continue the illegal occupation. You are going to continue all of those things, and you think that is going to produce a lasting peace. That is the justification that we're getting here from Netanyahu. It's utterly delusional. It is utterly delusional. Now, I'll finish off on this article here because he did say, and this is, it's interesting for a couple of reasons. He said that basically the fighting could end up ending in as little as a month. I have a very strong doubt about that. He says, we've destroyed 3/4 of Hamas's fighting terrorism battalions, and we're close to finishing the last part in warfare. He said the fighting would not take more than 2 months, maybe 6 weeks, maybe 4. Okay, and here's where a lot of the issue comes in. Netanyahu also gave his own death estimates, which are wildly off from the ones that we have from basically every other human rights organization. They say, and even the United States, they say some 13,000 Palestinian fighters had been killed, he said, while the civilian death rate was estimated at 1 to 1.5 for every combatant. That would put the total killed, fighters and civilians, at 26,000. Guys, keep in mind, we've gotten previous estimates on this, reliable estimates, showing that 2/3 of the people who have been killed in Gaza by Israel since October 7th have been women and children. Women and children, over 2/3 of those who have been killed. So the idea that you're going to say it is a 1 or a 1.5 ratio of combatants to civilians killed, it's mathematically impossible. I mean, I'm not going to do the math here in my head, but I'm pretty sure even if you said that literally every single man who you have killed inside of Gaza was a Hamas combatant, which obviously isn't the case, but even if you took that at face value, I don't even think that would get you to this ratio of 1 to 1.5. And I certainly am not confident in this projection here that they've killed 13,000 Palestinian fighters. Okay, maybe it's somewhere around 5,000, 7,000 on the upper end, maybe 9,000. Again, it's very hard to say. But 13,000. Now, also the issue with 13,000 is that previous Israeli estimates, estimated that Hamas had about 30,000 fighters. So how is 13,000, as he points out here, 3/4 of Hamas's fighting battalions? Guys, none of this math adds up. And so for that reason, either we're going to end up with a situation where Israel just unilaterally pulls out without actually defeating Hamas, whatever that means, or they're just going to continue for a much longer period of time than he's admitting here, right? And maybe this is just part of the PR strategy. Oh, don't worry about anything, guys. We're going to wrap it up in a month, maybe 6 weeks, maybe 2 months, and then that turns into 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, who knows what, right? So again, take that with what you will, or take that as you will, right? Now I'll finish off with this here because, and keep in mind, guys, this is an annual thing. This is not unique to the post-October 7th reality for Palestinians. The IDF are preventing Palestinians from entering Al-Aqsa Mosque on the first night of Ramadan. So obviously, again, we're entering the holy month of Ramadan for Muslims, and Al-Aqsa Mosque is one of the holiest sites in Islam. Israel has been illegally, effectively occupying this mosque for years and years and years now. They've done previous raids into it where they've tear gassed people and shot at people and arrested people who were peacefully praying. This is nothing new. But so basically what we have here is they'll set like some arbitrary rules in place where they'll say like, unless you're above the age of 40, then you're not allowed to enter the mosque. And they'll militarize the mosque. They have here, I mean, like you can see security guys standing up and preventing people from going in to pray. And then it inevitably ends up turning into a massive clash. And you see the IDF or the Israeli security forces going and, beating Palestinians who are trying to go in to worship on the first night of Ramadan. So, part of this is kind of just an intentional escalation that Israel does and an intentional provocation that Israel does on an annual basis. So this is nothing new, but especially at a time like this with Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, this kind of shit has an extra added potential to spark off into a massive uprising, okay, that could completely set off the West Bank and even potentially surrounding, countries and in protest of this kind of shit. So, I mean, listen, guys, it's, I know that we talk about Joe Biden and now Netanyahu coming out and saying, don't worry, people, it's going to be over in a month or a couple months. We're trying to get this 6-week ceasefire. I hope that there is a ceasefire. I hope genuinely from the bottom of my heart that there is anything that is done to alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe inside of Gaza. I'm just not confident in it based on the information that I'm seeing, based on the other, conflicting reports that we're getting that, contradict what Netanyahu says there and contradict what Biden says here. So, I mean, I'm not confident that this is going to wrap up soon. Again, I hope that it does. But from what I'm seeing right now, it seems like we are much more likely to end up with this sparking off into either a broader conflict in the West Bank as well as in Gaza with this upcoming invasion of Rafah and potentially even an escalation with Hezbollah Hezbollah in Lebanon. So, I mean, it's obviously not looking good as of right now. And Joe Biden seems to continue insisting that he basically does not have and is not willing to enforce any real red lines as Israel continues with their brutal offensive.